If you travel by train or car around Moscow, in every 100 meters, you will see the graves of Soviet soldiers. Every small town is full of them, and if you manage to find an old babushka to talk to about the Moscow battle, she will convey lots of details to you. Basically, the closest point where the Germans were can be reached by car in 20 minutes drive from Kremlin without traffic. Hello, and welcome again to the Global Cultural Drift Podcast. Geopolitical Queen, here with today's episode on how the German army almost reached Moscow in 1941. On the 22nd of June, 1941, Hitler unleashed Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in history to target Stalin's Soviet Union. It was the culmination of Hitler's thinking and theorizing about dealing with what he perceived to be his biggest enemy, the Soviet communism. 3.8 million Axis soldiers invaded and fought in the 5-month operation to destroy the USSR. The Red Army was caught off guard by the timing of the German assault. Its officer corps were fatally weakened by political purges reeled under the attacks. The German armies concentrated on 3 main objectives: Leningrad, Moscow, and Kiev in the first 30 days. Field Marshal Ritter Ford left the Army Group North and drove about 135 miles off Leningrad, whilst Hitler's Finnish allies also attacked towards the city. In the center of the front, Field Marshal Pharaoh von Bock's Army Group drove 480 miles. Many of the Soviet Union's most important cities fell to the Germans. On the 17th of July, von Bock captured Smolensk, the key to Moscow. At the same time, the Army Group South and Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt cut a swathe through the Ukraine. It appeared as though the Soviet Union was done with. Stalin had 800,000 men with which to defend the capital with, but of the AZ-3 divisions available, only some 25 were fully operational. The Germans launched Operation Typhoon, the assault on Moscow on the 30th of September 1941. The Army Group Center had to overcome a series of elaborate defensive lines centered on cities on the path to Moscow. The 2nd Panzer Group took Oryol, 75 miles south of the Soviet first main defensive line. 3 days later, the Panzers captured Bryansk, while the German Second Army attacked from the south. The Soviet 3rd and 13th Armies were encircled in the north. The 3rd and 4th Panzer Armies attacked the Asma, trapping 4 Soviet armies. The Germans had cracked Moscow's first offensive line and captured over 663,000 prisoners. From a total of 3 million captured since the start of Barbarossa, Stalin had only about 90,000 men and 150 tanks left to defend Moscow itself. On the 13th of October, the 3rd Panzer Group was only 87 miles from Moscow. Martial law was declared in the city, but the weather was bad with heavy rain and snow that turned the roads into mud. German tanks with their narrow tracks struggled to cope. On the 31st of October, a temporary halt to the advance was called to enable the Germans to reorganize their precarious supply situation. This gave the Soviets a breathing space. Stalin organized 11 new armies that included 30 divisions of tough Siberian troops, which were better able to cope with such conditions. 1,000 tanks also arrived. As the temperature fell, the mud froze, and the German advance resumed. On the 15th of November, the German plan was to move the 3rd and 4th Panzer Armies across the Moscow-Volga Canal and envelop the city from the northeast. The 2nd Panzer Group attacked Tula. Closed on Moscow from the south, these movements caused the bulk of the Soviet armies to move to deal with these threats. As they did so, the German 4th Army attacked the center for 2 weeks. Short of fuel and ammunition, the German armies fought forward towards the city in the south. The Soviets stopped the 2nd Panzer Group. On the 22nd of November, Siberian units counterattacked and defeated the 2nd Panzer, but the 4th Panzer Group managed to push the Soviets back and cross the Moscow-Volga Canal. The last major obstacle before the city itself were the units of the 7th Panzer Division, which were now 22 miles from Red Square and the Kremlin, but this group got no further aboard. On the 28th of November, a powerful Soviet counterattack pushed them back northwest of Moscow. The Germans reached Krasnaya Polyana, now Lavanya, just 18 miles from the Kremlin, but again, stiff Soviet resistance and German supply problems stopped them cold. However, the German 258th Infantry Division got closer. Part of the division's Panzer Pioneer Battalion appeared to have discovered a gap in the Soviet lines. On the 2nd of December 1941, a small number of light vehicles and motorcycle combinations reached the township of Khimki, close to the Moscow Ring Road. This was all that the Germans managed as well. Officers claimed to have seen through binoculars the gleaming golden domes and spires of the Red Square and the Kremlin from their position. At Khimki, they were 14 miles from the Kremlin, but the story is either exaggerated or a case of mistaken identity. Moscow in 1941 was fairly low-rise, so the Kremlin's buildings certainly stood out on the skyline. But many high-rise Soviet apartment blocks had been built along the main highways out of the city center. Also, Khimki in 1941 contained no tall buildings from which to get an elevated view of the far distance. Another problem with the story was that the Soviets had camouflaged both Red Square and the Kremlin. The golden spires had been painted in dark colors. The Kremlin walls were painted to look like buildings with windows. Camouflaged and plywood structures had been erected on the Red Square to confuse the street layout from the German Luftwaffe. Lenin's mausoleum was disguised as a two-story residential building in the snowy cold conditions. The Germans probably saw snow and frost reflecting off the roofs in strong sunlight, or they saw other towers and church domes in the general direction of central Moscow. Whatever the truth was, Khimki was as far as the Germans managed to get towards Moscow. The small number of German troops in the township waited for support that never came, and on the 3rd of December, a Soviet force of local militia, supported by a few T-34 tanks, managed to push them out of Khimki. The point of the farthest German advance was marked in 1966 by a memorial consisting of a giant Czech tank traps at kilometer 23 on the Leningrad Square highway into Moscow, next to a giant IKEA furniture store today. A severe winter weather descended, and supply problems got worse. The German offensive against Moscow stalled on the 5th of December. The Soviets launched a massive counterattack by the 7th of January, 1942, when the Soviet offensive halted. The Germans were pushed back between 60 and 150 miles from Moscow. The battle for Moscow was finally over. So there you have it, folks. If you enjoyed learning about how the Soviet Union freed itself from the German attack on Moscow, then kindly leave your comments in the comments section below. And thanks for tuning in. I will be back with the next broadcast. Good day.